What lies beneath America's most iconic building? When maintenance engineer Thomas Hale discovered an unmarked stone that shouldn't exist beneath the Capitol, he had no idea he was about to unearth America's darkest secret, one that powerful people have killed to protect for over 2 centuries. The hidden tunnel network he found beneath the Capitol's foundation contained evidence that would shatter the nation's origin story and destroy the legacy of its most revered founding fathers. But Thomas wasn't the first to discover this labyrinth of horrors, just the latest in a long line of witnesses who entered these forbidden passages. What historical crime is buried beneath the symbol of democracy itself? And why does everyone who discovers the truth beneath the Capitol's gleaming dome eventually disappear without a trace? The metallic sound pierced Thomas Hale's ears before anyone else noticed it. A hollow, resonant echo that shouldn't exist beneath the solid marble floor of the Capitol. His fingers froze against the cold stone as the vibration traveled up his arm. Something was wrong. The maintenance inspection that had been routine moments ago had just become something else entirely. "Did you hear that?" Thomas whispered, his breath visible in the unusually cool air of the rotunda's maintenance level. None of his team responded. He pressed his palm flat against the oddly discolored stone slab, feeling a faint but unmistakable current of air escaping through nearly invisible seams. Impossible. According to every architectural blueprint he'd studied during his 15 years as lead structural engineer, nothing existed beneath this section. Nothing but solid foundation. The blood drained from his face as he tapped the stone again, producing that same unnatural resonance. His heart accelerated to a painful rhythm, each beat a warning. Thomas had restored historical buildings across 3 continents, and he knew the difference between normal structural cavities and something deliberately hidden. "Maria, bring the thermal scanner," he called to his assistant, struggling to keep his voice steady. His fingertips tingled with a peculiar numbness that spread to his wrists. When he pulled his hand away from the stone, fine powder clung to his skin. Not ordinary dust, but something that seemed to shimmer faintly in the work lights. Maria knelt beside him, her dark eyes narrowing as the thermal imaging display revealed what shouldn't be there, a temperature differential forming a perfect rectangle beneath the floor. An opening. A door. "That's not on any blueprint," she whispered, a tremor in her usually confident voice. "Thomas, we should call this in before..." "Before what?" he interrupted, already retrieving a small pry bar from his toolkit. Something was pulling him forward. Professional curiosity, perhaps, or something deeper he couldn't name. This building has been standing since 1800. If there's a structural anomaly, we need to document it immediately. The other 3 members of the maintenance team gathered around, faces illuminated by the harsh LED work lights that cast sharp, unnatural shadows across the historic stonework. The Capitol was quiet tonight. Congress was in recess, and only minimal security patrols moved through the upper levels. They were alone here, 5 stories beneath the rotunda, in a section that tourists never saw. The pry bar slid into the nearly invisible seam with surprising ease, as if the stone had been designed to be removed. Thomas applied pressure, feeling sweat bead across his forehead despite the chill. The slab shifted with an audible scrape that echoed through the maintenance corridor. "Jesus," whispered Rodriguez, the youngest team member, his phone already recording. "That's not normal wear. Those are tool marks. Someone's opened this before." With a final heave, the stone slid sideways, revealing a dark vertical shaft and the top of what appeared to be a spiral staircase descending into absolute darkness. The air that rushed upward carried an unmistakable scent. Not the musty odor of an old basement, but something sharper, metallic, with undertones that made Thomas's stomach clench involuntarily. "Temperature reading shows it goes down at least another 30 feet, Maria reported, her voice clinically detached despite the slight trembling of the scanner in her hands. "The air composition is strange. Higher CO2 levels than normal, significantly lower oxygen." Thomas shined his flashlight into the opening, the beam swallowed by the darkness beyond the first few steps of the staircase. The stone steps were worn in their centers, evidence of countless footsteps over many years. But according to every historical record, every architectural plan, every renovation document he'd ever studied about the Capitol, This staircase didn't exist. We need to document this before we inform security, Thomas decided, already reaching for his camera. Full photographic record, measurements, air samples? I don't like this, Rodriguez muttered, taking an involuntary step backward. Something feels wrong. Those marks on the walls? Thomas's flashlight beam caught what Rodriguez had noticed, vertical scratches along the stone walls of the shaft. Not tool marks, not construction artifacts. They were long, parallel lines that started low and reached upward, tapering at the ends. Fingernail marks. As if someone had desperately tried to climb out. Thomas felt his professional detachment slipping, replaced by a primal unease that crawled up his spine, but it was too late to turn back. He'd already crossed some invisible threshold of discovery, and the weight of historical significance pressed down on him like the massive dome overhead. "I'm going down," he announced, securing his helmet light and checking his radio. "Maria, you'll monitor from here." Standard protocol, 15-minute communication checks. If I don't respond, call security. The protest from his team was immediate and unanimous, but Thomas silenced them with a raised hand. Whatever this is, it's been hidden for over 2 centuries. Think about what that means for American history. For architectural history, I need to see what's down there. Rodriguez reluctantly agreed to accompany him, while the others would maintain position at the entrance. As Thomas took his first step onto the worn stone staircase, the flashlight beam revealed something else. A small, faded inscription carved into the wall beside the opening. The Latin words were barely legible, weathered by time and deliberately obscured by someone's chisel marks. Veritas in tenebris sepulta est. Thomas translated it silently, the words echoing in his mind with terrible significance. Truth is buried in darkness. The staircase spiraled downward in a perfect mathematical progression, each step exactly 7 inches below the previous. Thomas counted silently as they descended. 14 steps, 21, 35, realizing they were following the Fibonacci sequence. This was not haphazard construction. This had been designed with precise, deliberate intent by someone with advanced mathematical knowledge. At the 49th step, the staircase ended abruptly at a narrow corridor that extended beyond the reach of their lights. The temperature had dropped significantly, and Thomas could see his breath forming small clouds in the beam of his helmet light. The walls here were different, not the sandstone of the upper structure, but older, rougher-hewn granite blocks that predated the Capitol's construction. "These weren't quarried for the building," Thomas whispered, running his fingers along the strange markings etched into the stone. "These were repurposed from something else, something much older." His radio crackled with Maria's voice, distorted by interference. "Thomas, status check. We're getting unusual electromagnetic readings up here. Something's affecting our equipment." "We're fine," he responded, trying to sound more confident than he felt. Proceeding down the corridor, "The construction here doesn't match any known phase of the Capitol's development. I think this predates the building itself." Rodriguez's light beam swept across the floor ahead, revealing dark stains that Thomas initially mistook for water damage. When he knelt to examine them, the realization hit him with physical force. The stains were oxidized iron, blood, ancient but unmistakable. The corridor widened suddenly into a small chamber, and both men stopped abruptly, their lights illuminating something that shouldn't exist beneath one of America's most iconic buildings. A perfectly circular room with 7 alcoves set into the walls, each containing what appeared to be a stone chair. But it was what lay in the center of the room that caused Thomas's professional composure to finally shatter. A pile of human bones, arranged in a precise geometric pattern, surrounding a stone pedestal that held a single object, a leather-bound book, its cover untouched by time or decay. "Rodriguez," Thomas said, his voice barely audible even to himself, "I think we've found something that was never meant to be found." As he stepped toward the center of the chamber, the sound of stone grinding against stone echoed from somewhere behind them. Thomas spun around in time to see the corridor entrance sliding shut, sealing them inside with the impossible archaeological discovery and the growing certainty that they weren't the first to find this place, and like those before them, they might never leave. Thomas's flashlight beam trembled across the ancient book. The leather binding showed no sign of decay, despite what must have been centuries in this sealed chamber. His training demanded he leave artifacts untouched, but something about this place defied all archaeological protocol. "We need to find a way out," Rodriguez said, his voice unnaturally sharp in the confined space. He was already examining the sealed doorway, fingers tracing the impossibly tight seams. "The air in here won't last forever." Thomas ignored him, drawn to the book like a moth to flame. When his fingers touched the leather cover, the material felt oddly warm, as if recently handled. No dust rose when he carefully opened it, revealing handwritten pages in a precise architectural script. "This is Jefferson's handwriting," Thomas whispered, the recognition immediate and jarring. He'd studied the Founding Fathers' architectural notes extensively during the Capitol's last restoration. "My God, Rodriguez, this is Thomas Jefferson's private journal." The first entry was dated April 18, 1793, 5 years before construction of the Capitol officially began. The text described necessary preparations beneath the foundation and compartments designed according to the ancient principles to ensure structural and philosophical alignment. Rodriguez abandoned the sealed door and joined Thomas, his expression shifting from panic to professional curiosity. "That's impossible. Jefferson wasn't the architect of record." "No, William Thornton was," Thomas confirmed, turning brittle pages. "But look, these are detailed drawings of this exact chamber. Jefferson knew about this place. He designed it." The journal detailed a secondary purpose to the Capitol's construction, something about containing historical truths too dangerous for the fragile republic. Subsequent entries grew increasingly paranoid, with references to sacrifices required for a foundation of lasting power. A sound like grinding stone made both men flinch. One of the 7 stone chairs in the alcoves had rotated slightly, revealing a narrow passageway behind it. "Motion triggered," Rodriguez whispered. Opening the book activated something. Thomas's professional excitement warred with primal fear. These mechanisms have worked perfectly for over 200 years. "That's architecturally impossible." He photographed several pages of the journal before returning it exactly as he'd found it. The implications were staggering. One of America's founding fathers had created a secret complex beneath the Capitol, containing human remains arranged in ritualistic patterns. The newly revealed passage emitted a faint current of fresh air. Survival instinct overcame archaeological hesitation, and both men squeezed through the opening into a narrow corridor stretching into darkness. Their helmet lights revealed walls covered with hand-carved text, not in Latin or English, but in languages Thomas recognized as Algonquian and Iroquoian, indigenous scripts that predated European settlement. Interspersed were unmistakable architectural notations in Jefferson's hand. He incorporated Native American construction into the Capitol's foundation, Thomas realized aloud. But why keep it secret? The corridor widened into another chamber, smaller than the first, but more precisely constructed. The walls formed a perfect octagon, each surface covered with mathematical equations and astronomical charts. At the center stood a wooden desk, the surface still bearing quill marks and ink stains. "This was a workspace," Rodriguez said, examining the desk without touching it. "Someone spent significant time down here." Thomas noticed something else. A metal lockbox tucked beneath the desk, its brass surface tarnished but intact. The keyhole was shaped unlike any lock he'd ever encountered. His radio crackled suddenly, startling both men. Maria's voice came through, distorted but audible. "Thomas? Security is asking questions. They've detected our presence in a restricted sublevel. You need to come up now." Thomas pressed the transmit button. "Maria, we've found—" He stopped himself, suddenly unsure what to report. Evidence that Thomas Jefferson had built secret chambers beneath the Capitol, that he'd incorporated Native American remains into its foundation. The career implications were as dizzying as the historical ramifications. Rodriguez touched his arm, pointing to a section of wall where the stone patterns didn't quite align. "That's another door. This isn't just a room, it's a hub. There are more passages." Thomas made his decision. "Maria, tell security we're investigating structural anomalies. Request a full team with proper documentation equipment. And Maria, tell them to bring the classified architectural archives. The ones requiring presidential clearance. "What are you doing?" Rodriguez whispered, eyes wide. Thomas traced the edge of the hidden passage with trembling fingers. "Whatever Jefferson buried down here, he buried it for a reason. And I think that reason is still relevant today." The narrow passage twisted downward at an uncomfortable angle. Thomas had to crouch, his back muscles spasming as they progressed deeper beneath the Capitol. Rodriguez followed silently, his breathing increasingly labored in the thin air. Their helmet lights cast jumping shadows that transformed the ancient stonework into grotesque faces, then back to innocuous patterns with each movement. "The security team will be looking for us," Rodriguez whispered, his voice tighter than before. "If this section isn't in any official blueprint, we're technically trespassing on restricted government property." Thomas didn't respond. His mind was consumed by the implications of Jefferson's journal, a founding father, creating secret chambers beneath a symbol of democracy. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming, like discovering your family's beloved heirloom was actually stolen property. The passage abruptly widened into a circular chamber significantly larger than the previous rooms. Thomas's light swept across the space, illuminating what at first appeared to be a pile of construction debris in the center. When the beam settled, both men froze. Human skulls, dozens of them, arranged in concentric circles around a central stone marker. Beyond them lay hundreds more bones, femurs, ribs, vertebrae, organized with deliberate precision. This wasn't random storage of remains, it was a methodical cataloging. "Thomas?" Rodriguez's voice cracked. "These aren't colonial-era remains." Thomas knelt beside the nearest skull, careful not to disturb anything. The cranial structure was distinctive, with certain anthropological markers he recognized from university studies. Native American, probably Powhatan or Piscataway, indigenous to this region. The skulls had been positioned facing outward, as if forced to witness something. Several showed evidence of violent trauma, precise holes and fracture patterns consistent with execution-style killing. Thomas's mind raced through historical records. The official narrative stated that the Capitol was built on undeveloped land purchased from local farmers. Nothing in any historical document mentioned indigenous burial grounds or settlements on the site. The founding of Washington was a complete historical fabrication, Thomas whispered, more to himself than Rodriguez. "What's that?" Rodriguez pointed to a metal container partially buried beneath the smallest collection of bones, remains that appeared to belong to children. Thomas carefully extracted it without disturbing the bones. The container was lead-lined, perfectly preserved. Inside were documents on parchment, the ink faded but legible. The top sheet bore the signatures of several founding fathers, including Washington and Jefferson. Thomas read aloud. "Regarding the necessary removal of native obstacles at the Capitol site, all records of the prior inhabitants shall be expunged from official documentation. The foundation of this republic requires certain sacrifices which posterity must never judge." Rodriguez backed away, his face ashen. "This is a mass grave. They cleared indigenous people from this land and buried the evidence. Literally buried it." Thomas continued reading, his professional detachment crumbling with each line. The document detailed the removal of 93 men, 57 women, and 34 children from a settlement that had existed on the exact location where the Capitol now stood. The dates aligned precisely with the early planning stages of Washington, D.C. The clinical language of the document, specimens obtained, obstacle clearance, foundation security, created a sickening contrast with the human remains surrounding them. "Thomas, we need to report this," Rodriguez said, his voice steadier now, resolved. "This changes American history. The public deserves to know." Thomas hesitated. "You understand what this means? The Capitol, the literal seat of American democracy, was built on a foundation of genocide, carefully concealed by the very men schoolchildren are taught to revere." Before Rodriguez could respond, both men froze at a sound from the passage behind them. Footsteps. Too many to be just Maria and the maintenance team. Thomas quickly photographed the documents, then returned them exactly as they'd found them. His training insisted these artifacts must be preserved in context, but his conscience demanded documentation. "There's another exit," Thomas whispered, indicating a narrow opening barely visible behind a section of curved wall. "Security will come through the main passage. We need more time before this becomes officially discovered and contained." Rodriguez's eyes widened in understanding. "You think they'll cover it up again? I think there are 200 years of precedent suggesting exactly that." The footsteps grew closer. Thomas made his decision, moving toward the hidden passage. "The truth about this place needs to come from us, not from whoever sanitizes official history." The secondary passage narrowed to the point where Thomas and Rodriguez had to press their shoulders against rough stone walls. The sound of security personnel faded behind them, replaced by their own ragged breathing and the occasional scrape of equipment against rock. "My GPS isn't working down here," Rodriguez whispered, checking his phone. "We're completely off the grid." Thomas nodded, conserving oxygen. The weight of what they'd discovered pressed against his chest more heavily than the confines of the tunnel. American history, his history, had been built on a deliberate lie. The iconic white dome that represented democracy worldwide cast a shadow far darker than he'd ever imagined. The passage eventually opened into a small antechamber. Unlike the ceremonial precision of the burial room, this space was utilitarian, a workspace with metal filing cabinets embedded directly into the stone walls. Though tarnished by time, they showed no significant deterioration in the controlled environment. "Document preservation," Thomas observed, running his fingers along a cabinet edge. "Temperature and humidity in this chamber are perfect for archival storage." Rodriguez pulled open the nearest drawer, revealing meticulously organized folders. The labels bore dates from 1791 through 1802, the planning and early construction period of the capital. Thomas extracted one labeled "Indigenous Removal, Executive Authorization." The document inside bore George Washington's signature, authorizing whatever measures necessary to secure the Capitol grounds and ensure no inconvenient histories remain to trouble the nation's foundation. Jefferson's countersignature appeared below, along with detailed accounting of payments for discreet services rendered by military personnel operating without uniform or identification. "They didn't just kill them," Thomas said, his voice hollow. "They erased them from history entirely. There's not a single historical record of this settlement." Rodriguez opened another drawer, pulling out architectural drawings. "Look at this. Jefferson incorporated the burial chamber into the building's foundation design. He made it a structural element. The Capitol literally cannot stand without it." Thomas flipped through more documents, each more damning than the last. Correspondence between founding fathers discussing the necessity of certain moral compromises for the greater purpose of the Republic. Clinical reports on the efficiency of operations at the Capitol site. Detailed inventories of indigenous artifacts requiring disposal. "This isn't just a historical cover-up," Thomas said, his historian's detachment crumbling. "It's premeditated cultural genocide, documented by the founders themselves." Rodriguez's face had gone pale, the ethical implications visibly overwhelming him. "If we release this, what happens to America? To everything built on this foundation of lies?" The question hung between them, impossible to answer. Thomas carefully photographed each document, hands trembling. His professional obligation to historical truth warred against the potential consequences of that truth. The America he had served and believed in seemed to dissolve with each page he documented. "We can't be the only ones who found this," Rodriguez said suddenly. "This place has existed for over 2 centuries. Someone else must have discovered it before us." Thomas froze, the implications striking him with physical force. Then where are their records, their exposés, their historical revisions? A distant sound, metal scraping against stone, came from somewhere in the tunnel network. Thomas quickly returned the documents to their exact positions, muscle memory from archaeological training taking over, despite his emotional turmoil. "We need to find another way out," he whispered. "Security isn't just looking for maintenance workers now. They're containing a historical breach." Rodriguez nodded grimly. "If we surface through the main entrance, whatever we've documented will never see daylight." Thomas pointed to another narrow opening, partly concealed behind a filing cabinet. "That's our only option. deeper into the complex. And if there's no exit? Thomas met his colleague's eyes, the weight of their discovery hanging between them. Then history repeats itself, more inconvenient truths buried beneath the capital. The new passage constricted to a crawl space barely 18 inches high. Thomas dragged himself forward on elbows and knees, the rough stone tearing at his maintenance uniform. Rodriguez followed, his breathing increasingly labored in the thin air. The weight of the capital, hundreds of thousands of tons of marble and history, pressed down on them both physically and psychologically. "The structural integrity down here is compromised," Thomas whispered, his engineer's eye catching the hairline fractures running through the stone above them. These tunnels weren't designed to last centuries without maintenance. A fine shower of limestone dust trickled onto his back as he spoke, emphasizing his point. The tunnel network, built to conceal genocide, was itself beginning to fail. There was poetry in that, Thomas thought, a historical lie collapsing under its own weight. Rodriguez had fallen silent, conserving oxygen, his eyes fixed and dilated in the harsh beam of his helmet light. The psychological toll of their discovery was visible in the rigid set of his jaw, the tremor in his hands when he checked his camera's memory card for the 15th time in an hour. The crawlspace abruptly opened into another chamber, smaller than the previous ones, and clearly designed for a different purpose. A desk was bolted to the floor, the wood preserved in the controlled environment. Beside it stood a colonial-era chair with manacles attached to the arms. "An interrogation room," Thomas said, the pieces clicking into place. "They questioned the indigenous people here before executing them." Rodriguez examined the chair without touching it. "The craftsmanship matches furniture in Independence Hall. This was custom-built for this purpose, not repurposed." Thomas opened the desk drawer, finding a leather-bound logbook. The entries in multiple handwritings detailed information extraction from native subjects. Dates, names, methods used, and results obtained, all documented with dispassionate precision by men whose signatures Thomas recognized from historical documents displayed in museums throughout Washington. "They wanted information about other settlements," Thomas said, skimming the entries. "Locations of villages, tribal connections, knowledge of the land. This wasn't just clearance for the capital site, it was reconnaissance for territorial expansion." A distant cracking sound interrupted him, stone shifting somewhere in the tunnel network. Both men froze, uncertain if it was pursuing security personnel or the structure itself giving way. "We need to keep moving," Rodriguez urged, his composure fraying. "If there's another exit, it must be—" His words cut short as a section of wall beside them collapsed, revealing a previously sealed chamber. Thomas instinctively shielded his face from the dust, then directed his light into the new opening. A skeleton still sat upright against the wall, wrists bound by rusted shackles. Colonial-era clothing hung in tatters from the bones. Unlike the ceremonially arranged remains in the burial chamber, this body had been walled up alive and forgotten. "My God," Rodriguez whispered, backing away. "They imprisoned someone down here." Thomas carefully examined the scene without disturbing it. The skeleton's posture told a story of final desperation, knees drawn up, head bowed, one hand still clutching something. Thomas zoomed his camera lens to capture the detail, a quill pen and a scrap of paper. The paper bore faded writing, "They know." "Not a native victim," Thomas said quietly. "Look at the clothing quality. This was someone from their own circle, someone who threatened to expose what they'd done." Another ominous crack echoed through the chamber, followed by a more sustained rumble. Dust and small stone fragments showered down from the ceiling. The structural failure was accelerating. "The weight distribution is shifting," Thomas said, professional knowledge temporarily overriding historical horror. "The capital above us is settling. These tunnels are becoming unstable." Rodriguez grabbed Thomas's arm. "We need to find an exit now." Thomas stared at the colonial-era whistleblower, silenced forever beneath the symbol of American democracy. "If we don't make it out, at least we'll have company. Someone else who died for the truth." The ceiling groaned, a deep resonant sound of stone under impossible pressure. A jagged crack raced across the chamber above them. "Run!" Thomas shouted, abandoning archaeological protocol as he pulled Rodriguez toward the only remaining passage. Behind them, the interrogation chamber collapsed in a deafening roar of stone and history crumbling together. Daylight stabbed Thomas's eyes like needles when they finally emerged through a maintenance access point, 3 levels below the Capitol's main floor. His lungs burned with each breath of fresh air, the oxygen-rich atmosphere almost intoxicating after hours in the tunnel network. Rodriguez stumbled behind him, face gray with limestone dust, a trickle of dried blood running from his temple where falling debris had struck him during their escape. They emerged not into the expected maintenance corridor, but a security checkpoint hastily established in their absence. 4 men in dark suits stood waiting, earpieces and lapel pins identifying them as something beyond standard Capitol security. Behind them stood Maria, her expression frozen in a mixture of relief and unrecognizable emotion. "Mr. Hale, Mr. Rodriguez." The lead agent stepped forward, his tone neutral yet authoritative. "You've caused quite the concern. Unauthorized exploration of restricted sub-level areas is a federal offense." Thomas struggled to process the scene. The checkpoint appeared too organized, too prepared for their emergence, as if someone had anticipated exactly where they would resurface. "We discovered historically significant architectural features," Thomas said carefully. Academic terminology, providing temporary shelter from the full implications of what they'd found. Tunnels predating the Capitol's official construction. Documentation that requires preservation and analysis. The agent's expression remained unchanged. "All materials and recordings will need to be secured for national security review." Rodriguez tensed beside Thomas. "With respect, sir, this is an archaeological discovery. Protocol requires academic documentation and—" "This is the United States Capitol," the agent interrupted. "Standard protocols don't apply here." Thomas's hand instinctively touched his pocket, where his phone stored hundreds of photographs. Evidence of founding fathers orchestrating genocide and historical erasure. The memory card from his camera contained even more detailed documentation. The weight of that evidence pressed against him like a physical force. "Your equipment, please." The agent extended his hand. Maria stepped forward, her voice unnaturally controlled. "Thomas, please. They've explained the situation to me. There are structural concerns, safety protocols." Thomas studied her face. The woman he'd worked with for 7 years. Something was wrong. Her eyes didn't meet his, focusing instead on a point just past his shoulder. The slight tremor in her left hand betrayed tension beyond normal concern. "Where are the others?" Thomas asked, suddenly realizing the rest of their maintenance team was absent. "Debriefing," Maria answered too quickly. Thomas made a show of reaching for his phone, then deliberately fumbled it. As he knelt to retrieve it, he ejected the memory card with a practiced motion and slipped it into his sock. When he stood, he handed over the device with feigned reluctance. "Everything we saw is already backed up to cloud storage," he lied, watching for reactions. "Automated uploads every 30 seconds. Standard archaeological protocol." A flicker of something, concern, calculation, crossed the lead agent's face. "We'll need those access credentials as well." Rodriguez suddenly doubled over in a coughing fit, drawing attention. Thomas caught his eye during the distraction, a silent communication between colleagues who had just witnessed history unraveling beneath their feet. Rodriguez's slight nod confirmed he understood. "Medical assistance is waiting upstairs," the agent said, gesturing toward the elevator. "After assessment, we'll conduct a thorough debriefing." As they walked toward the elevator, Thomas noticed maintenance crews already sealing the access point they'd emerged from with industrial equipment. Not repairs, permanent closure. The evidence was being entombed again, just as it had been 2 centuries earlier. In the elevator, surrounded by agents, Thomas caught his reflection in the polished metal wall. Dust-covered, bloodied, eyes hollow with the weight of impossible knowledge. The Capitol dome loomed above them, no longer a symbol of democracy, but a magnificent headstone marking buried truths. "They'll never let this become public," Rodriguez whispered, voice barely audible. Thomas met his colleague's eyes in the reflection. "History is written by those who control the evidence." The elevator doors opened to a floor Thomas didn't recognize, a sub-level absent from any architectural plan he'd studied. Men in military uniforms waited with medical personnel. The weight of institutional power pressed down, heavier than all the stone that had nearly crushed them below. 3 weeks after the Capitol incident, Thomas sat alone in his apartment, surrounded by newspaper clippings and printouts from government archives. The television murmured in the background, a congressional hearing about budget allocations for historical preservation. The irony wasn't lost on him. The memory card from the tunnels lay on his desk, its contents partially corrupted. Many photographs remained viewable. Jefferson's journal, The Indigenous Remains, the colonial whistleblower chained to the wall. But the most damning documentary evidence, the Founding Fathers' signatures on genocide orders, had degraded into digital noise. Not random corruption, targeted. Thomas hadn't seen Rodriguez since their debriefing 10 days ago. His colleague had been escorted to a separate room, and subsequent calls to his home went unanswered. Maria had returned to work briefly, avoiding Thomas's eyes before requesting sudden administrative leave. The maintenance team's official report listed the incident as routine structural assessment with minor safety concerns. The knock at his door startled Thomas from his thoughts. Through the peephole he saw only an empty hallway. Heart pounding, he opened the door to find a padded envelope on his welcome mat. No postmark, no sender information. Inside was Rodriguez's personal notebook. The pages contained his colleague's precise architectural sketches of the tunnel network, but with a disturbing addition. In the margins, increasingly frantic notes documented Rodriguez's certainty of being followed. Phones tapped, computer compromised. The final entry, dated 3 days ago, read simply, "They're coming. Remember, the walls spoke truth." Thomas closed the blinds, suddenly aware of the vulnerability of glass windows. The notebook confirmed his worst fears. Rodriguez had disappeared because he knew too much, and someone had delivered this warning directly to Thomas's door, bypassing building security. He examined his apartment with new eyes. The slightly misaligned books on his shelf, the moved papers on his desk. The subtle wrongness of objects returned to almost, but not exactly, their original positions. Someone had searched his home while he was out. His phone chimed with a news alert. Architectural historian Rodriguez Sanchez found dead in apparent suicide. The report cited depression over professional disagreements and increasingly paranoid behavior. The room tilted around Thomas. Rodriguez, meticulous and precise, would never have ended his life. The suicide was too convenient, too aligned with the narrative of unstable historians making wild claims. They had silenced a witness and simultaneously discredited any claims he might have made. Thomas sat at his computer, hands hovering over the keyboard. He could email the remaining evidence to journalists, historians, indigenous rights organizations, create so many copies that silencing every source would be impossible. His finger trembled on the mouse button, but the image of Rodriguez's suicide flooded his mind. If he pressed this button, how long before another tragic accident claimed him too? More disturbingly, would anyone believe him? Or would his evidence be dismissed as the ravings of another unstable academic, contaminated by association with Rodriguez's paranoid delusions? Thomas backed away from the computer. Not yet. He needed leverage, protection. The memory card wasn't enough, too easily discredited or confiscated. He needed something irrefutable that couldn't be buried again. He spread a map of Washington across his table, tracing the Capitol's foundation lines. If the tunnel network extended beneath the Capitol, there might be other access points, maintenance shafts, drainage systems, original construction elements incorporated into later renovations, something overlooked by those who wanted this history entombed. The solution crystallized with terrible clarity. He needed to return to the tunnels, not through the Capitol, where security would be impenetrable now, but through older infrastructure that connected to the original network. Historical maps showed a series of drainage tunnels from the early 1800s that might intersect with Jefferson's secret chambers. Thomas packed a small bag with essential documentation equipment. This time he would go alone. No colleagues at risk, no institutional constraints. Just one historian determined to preserve the truth, whatever the personal cost. As he prepared to leave, Thomas glanced at the Capitol dome visible through his window, illuminated against the night sky. For the first time in his career, he saw not the triumph of democracy, but a monument to historical erasure. A beautiful, gleaming deception. He left his apartment without looking back, the weight of historical truth heavier than all the marble of the Capitol dome. Thomas descended into Washington's forgotten infrastructure through an abandoned maintenance tunnel near the tidal basin. The century-old drainage system was a labyrinth of crumbling brick and corroded iron, slick with condensation and decades of neglect. His headlamp cast monstrous shadows that crawled across the curved walls as he advanced toward the Capitol grounds. Colonial-era engineering gradually replaced modern construction, brick giving way to hand-cut stone, modern pipes to clay channels. Thomas recognized Jefferson's architectural fingerprints, the precise mathematical spacing of support arches, the distinctive keystone pattern. He was on the right track. The tunnels narrowed as he approached the Capitol foundation, forcing him to crouch and eventually crawl. His recording equipment captured everything. His breathless narration, the architectural evidence, the gradual transition from public infrastructure to secret history. If he didn't survive this expedition, the evidence would. 4 hours into his journey, Thomas reached a partially collapsed section that matched his memory of the chambers they'd discovered weeks earlier. The damage from the structural failure was extensive, but navigable. He squeezed through a narrow opening, emerging into the room with the filing cabinets, now partially crushed by fallen stone. One cabinet remained intact. Thomas pried it open, finding a leather folio that had escaped their earlier investigation. Inside lay the architectural master plan of the entire tunnel network, bearing Jefferson's signature and personal seal. More damning were the attached letters discussing the necessary removal of inconvenient witnesses to ensure the Capitol's unblemished symbolism. Thomas photographed everything, hands trembling. This was the irrefutable evidence he needed, proof of both the indigenous genocide and the subsequent silencing of colonial-era whistleblowers who had threatened to expose it. A noise behind him, footsteps on stone, shattered the silence. Thomas extinguished his light, pressing himself against the wall. The intruder moved with confidence through the darkness, clearly familiar with the tunnel network. Government security had anticipated his return. Thomas uploaded the photographs to multiple secure servers, then slipped the memory card into a small waterproof container and wedged it into a narrow crevice in the stone wall, a future archaeological gift. The folio itself he secured in his waterproof bag. Physical evidence that couldn't be digitally erased. The footsteps grew closer. Thomas saw only one escape route, deeper into the tunnel network, away from his planned exit. Each step took him further from safety, deeper into the labyrinth where Rodriguez's ghost seemed to whisper warnings. Hours blurred as Thomas navigated the decaying passages. His water ran out, his headlamp dimmed. The tunnels began to feel less like architecture and more like a living organism constricting around him. History itself was swallowing him whole. In his final recording, voice parched and strained, Thomas detailed everything they'd discovered: the genocide, the cover-up, the continued silencing of witnesses. He named names, historical figures, and current officials. He left nothing to interpretation. The foundation of American democracy, he whispered into the recorder, is literally built on the bones of the people who were here first. The white marble of the Capitol is just the headstone of a mass grave. The recording ended there. Thomas Hale was never seen again. 2 days later, his apartment was found empty. His research materials had vanished. A suicide note appeared on his computer, rambling accusations of government conspiracies, expressed in language entirely unlike Thomas's methodical academic style. Officials attributed his disappearance to professional pressure and psychological distress following his colleague's suicide. The memory card remained hidden in the tunnel wall. The folio vanished into classified archives. The history books remained unchanged. Each day, thousands of tourists stream through the Capitol Rotunda, admiring the soaring dome and the paintings depicting America's noble founding. They stand directly above the hidden chambers, the indigenous remains, the erased history. Their photos capture the gleaming white marble, the perfect symbol of democracy. None of them hear the whispers beneath their feet, the truth that waits in darkness, buried but not quite dead. A truth that, like all buried things, eventually finds its way to the surface. History is built on the stories we choose to tell and the truths we decide to bury. Thomas Hale faced the ultimate moral dilemma: expose a foundation of lies and potentially destabilize a nation, or become complicit in centuries of deception. What would you have done with such knowledge? Would you have risked everything for historical truth, or accepted that some secrets remain buried for a reason? Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of this story isn't what happened beneath the Capitol, but how easily institutions can erase inconvenient truths and silence those who discover them. The monuments we revere, the histories we celebrate, the very ground beneath our feet, all may harbor darker stories than we're prepared to acknowledge. Thomas disappeared seeking truth, becoming part of the very history he tried to uncover. If this story left you questioning the narratives we take for granted, remember that true patriotism sometimes means confronting uncomfortable truths. Every nation has chapters written in darkness. Consider subscribing to hear more hidden histories, tales of discoveries that challenged established narratives, and the brave individuals who risked everything in pursuit of truth. Like and share if you believe that understanding our complete past, both glorious and shameful, is the only way to build an honest future.